A revolver that once sold for $125 just brought $1.4 million. A rifle serial number 1 sold for $5.9 million in June 2026. These aren't museum relics. Regular collectors already own guns just like them. Here are 10 firearms serious collectors refuse to sell before 2027, and the numbers that prove why. Number 10 is the original Colt SP1 AR-15, and most people scroll right past it because it just looks like an AR-15. Colt started selling the SP1 to civilians in January 1964, 1 year after the very first pilot models were shown to the government. Early rifles with 3- and 4-digit serial numbers, built between 1963 and 1966, are now the ones collectors chase hardest. Mint, unmodified examples from that window sell for $3,250 to $3,500 today, and that number climbs higher for guns still in their original green label boxes. Here's what most owners don't realize. The 1994 assault weapons ban outlawed features like bayonet lugs and certain flash hiders on new rifles, which means any SP1 made before that date is now a documented pre-ban gun in the eyes of collectors and, in some states, the law. That single detail turns an otherwise ordinary rifle into a protected category. The catch is originality. Swap the handguards, refinish the metal, or add a modern optic mount, and the value drops fast, because collectors want the rifle exactly as Colt shipped it 6 decades ago. What makes this entry easy to overlook is that so many SP1s got customized over the decades, since people bought them to shoot, not to preserve. That means truly untouched examples are becoming genuinely rare, and the guys holding on to stock SP1s from the 1960s are sitting on rifles that document the very beginning of America's most popular rifle platform. Number 9. Pre-64 Winchester Model 70. Number 9 is the Pre-64 Winchester Model 70, nicknamed the rifleman's rifle by hunters and collectors alike. In 1964, Winchester redesigned the Model 70 to cut manufacturing costs, replacing the hand-fitted controlled round-feed action with a cheaper push-feed design. Collectors immediately drew a hard line at that year, and they still do. A pre-64 Model 70 in solid condition now averages between $1,380 and $1,600 on the used market, and rare caliber variants push well past that. Take the .300 Savage chambering. Winchester only ever built 362 Model 70s in that caliber, which makes an original one genuinely difficult to find. The rifle also carries real history beyond the spec sheet. Legendary Marine Corps sniper Carlos Hathcock used a Model 70 for some of his most famous long-range shots. And that connection still drives demand from collectors who care about provenance as much as mechanics. What keeps this gun overlooked is that it doesn't look flashy sitting in a rack next to modern tactical rifles. It's just plain walnut and blued steel. But that plainness is exactly the point. Winchester stopped making rifles this way over 60 years ago, and every year the surviving examples in top condition get harder to replace. Number 8. The Luger P08. Number 8 is the German Luger P08. Adopted by the German military in 1908 and carried by soldiers through both world wars. Millions of American GIs brought Lugers home as war souvenirs, which means plenty are still out there in attics and gun safes. But that doesn't mean they're all worth the same. Value comes down almost entirely in original finish. Matching Serial 1 Luger with all matching parts runs around $1,425. A pre-war 1937 Mauser production model can top $3. Boo, because of its build quality. At the very top of the market sits the so-called Black Widow, a World War II Mauser-made Luger from 1941 and 1942 with an all-black finish. And a genuine matching example of that variant has sold for as much as $3,826. Here's the mistake that costs collectors money. A Luger that's been re-blued to look shiny and new has actually lost most of its collector value because serious buyers want the original wear, not a fresh finish. That's what makes this gun so easy to underestimate. It looks like just another old war pistol sitting in a display case, but a documented, all-matching example with its original finish intact is a completely different asset than a mismatched shooter-grade gun worth a fraction as much. Number 7. Smith & Wesson Model 29. Number 7 is the Smith & Wesson Model 29. The revolver forever linked to one line of movie dialogue. Gun writer and cartridge developer Elmer Keith spent years pushing the .44 Special to its limits until Smith & Wesson turned his work into a factory cartridge, the .44 Magnum, and built the Model 29 around it starting in 1955. For over a decade, it stayed a niche gun for hunters and serious handgunners. Then in 1971, Clint Eastwood carried one in Dirty Harry and called it the most powerful handgun in the world, and demand exploded almost overnight. Smith & Wesson discontinued standard production of the Model 29 in the late 1990s, which pushed collector attention toward the earlier pinned and recessed guns built before 1982, since those carry the tighter factory tolerances collectors associate with the original run. Early 4 and 5 screw pre-Model 29 examples from 1955 to 1957 now sell for $1,500 to $3,000 or more, while typical later production runs $400 to $900. What makes this one worth watching is that the movie connection isn't fading. New generations keep discovering Dirty Harry, and every rerun brings fresh buyers looking for the exact gun from the screen, which keeps steady pressure under the earliest and most correct examples. Number 6 is the Colt Python, a revolver gun writers of its era called the finest production revolver ever made. Colt introduced it in 1955 and hand-fitted and hand-polished every single one, which is exactly why it became so expensive to keep building. Production slowed to special order only after 1996, and Colt discontinued it completely in 2005. For years afterward, vintage Python prices climbed steadily, driven by the simple fact that Colt no longer had the skilled labor to make more of them. A clean example from the 1970s now routinely sells for $3,000 to $6,000. Rare short-barrel nickel finishes have brought as much as $7,000. And a documented mint 1955 nickel Python has sold to a collector for over $30,000. The demand got another push when the character Rick Grimes carried a Python through The Walking Dead, introducing the gun to an entirely new audience that had never handled a revolver before. Colt actually brought the Python back into production in 2020. And part of the reason was that vintage prices had gotten so far out of reach for regular shooters. That reissue proves the point rather than undercutting it. Even Colt admits the original run is a different, finite thing, and that's exactly why collectors who already own an original are holding on tight. The number 5, the M1 Garand. And this is the one entry on this list with an actual closing window instead of a vague prediction. For decades, the civilian marksmanship program sold genuine World War II surplus Garands to qualified American buyers at reasonable prices. That supply has now largely run dry. As of 2026, the service, field, and rack grades that most collectors bought for years are sold out, leaving only the higher-tier expert grade and custom shop special. The program itself has started selling brand new forged receiver Garands built with a modern manufacturing partner. And its own stated reason is blunt. The supply of government surplus rifles will not last forever. That's not marketing language pulled from a dealer's website. It's the federal program admitting the well is running dry. On the private market, prices for comparable surplus grades have more than tripled over the last decade, and a collector-grade example with matching, correct parts now runs $2,000 to $3,000 or more. Here's the part that matters most for anyone thinking about 2027. A brand new Garand built this year, no matter how well made, will never carry the same weight as an original receiver forged during World War II. Once the surplus pipeline is fully gone, that distinction becomes permanent, and it can't be manufactured back into existence. Number 4. Number 4 is the Winchester Model 1873, known for generations as the gun that won the West. It wasn't the first lever-action rifle, but it became the one that defined the American frontier for settlers, lawmen, and soldiers alike, thanks to its reliability and fast reloading. The 1873's real ancestor is the Henry rifle, and that lineage just proved how far this category can climb. In June 2026, Henry Rifle Serial Number 1 sold at Rock Island Auction Company for $5.875 million, tying the record for the most expensive firearm ever sold. That gun was presented to a member of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet in the 1860s, and it's considered the direct ancestor of every lever-action rifle built since, the Winchester 1873 included. It's not the only record in this family either. Back in 2016, a Winchester Model 1886 Serial Number 1, tied to the capture of Apache leader Geronimo, set what was then the world record for a rifle at auction. Most standard Winchester 1873s sell for far more reasonable prices than those record-setting examples, but that's exactly why this entry matters for regular collectors. You don't need a seven-figure gun to own a piece of the same bloodline that keeps setting world records. And that historical weight is part of what keeps steady demand under even ordinary examples of the models. Number 3 is an entire category rather than a single gun. Pre-1986 transferable machine guns, including classics like the M16, the Thompson, the MAC-10, and the Uzi. In 1986, Congress passed the Hughes Amendment, which permanently closed the machine gun registry to new civilian transfers. Every fully automatic firearm legally registered before May 19, 1986 is all that will ever legally exist for private ownership in America. Nothing new can be added to that pool, ever, and the pool only shrinks as guns are lost, damaged, or destroyed over time. The math on this one is simple and well documented. A MAC-10 that sold for around $1,500 back in 1986 trades for roughly $10,000 today. A transferable M16 lower receiver worth about $7,000 in the mid-1990s now sells for $35,000 to $45,000. A Thompson that cost around $15,000 in the year 2000 is worth close to $45,000 now. At the extreme end, rare pieces like transferable FG42s and MG42s have cleared $400,000 at auction. Dealers who specialize in this market describe prices as having rarely dropped in over 3 decades, since demand keeps growing while the legal supply is locked in place by federal law. That combination, a hard legal ceiling on supply and a collector base that keeps expanding, is about as close to guaranteed appreciation as the firearms world gets. And it's exactly why owners in this category almost never sell. 2 is the Singer 1911 A1, widely called the Holy Grail among 1911 collectors. And the story behind it sounds almost made up. The Singer Manufacturing Company, the same one known for sewing machines, was awarded a wartime education order in 1940 to study whether it could mass-produce 1911 pistols for the military. Singer built exactly 500 of them before handing its tooling and documentation over to Remington Rand in 1941 and moving on to other war production. That makes the Singer 1911 A1 the lowest production 1911 variant the U.S. military ever fielded, and historians estimate only somewhere between 125 and 163 genuine examples still survive today. When a well-documented, high-condition Singer comes up for sale, the numbers get serious fast. One sold at Rock Island Auction Company in September 2018 for $414,000. Verified, well-preserved examples with solid documentation typically trade privately in the $100 to $250,000 range. Even a lower condition, serial number 1 example still brought $80,500 at auction. Almost every Singer that left the factory in 1940 and 1941 went straight to the U.S. Army Air Corps, issued to air crews at a time when bomber losses over Europe ran brutally high, which is part of why so few survived the war at all. The pistols carry small but specific details collectors look for, including correct factory markings on the slide and an inspector's stamp confirming military acceptance. Even the accessories carry weight in this market. Original Singer magazines are so scarce that a collector was once offered $35,000 for a single spare magazine and turned it down. Dealers specializing in high-end 1911s have listed verified Singers for as much as $250,000, and prices have generally climbed every few years as fewer originals remain in private hands. That combination of wartime scarcity, battlefield attrition, and a tiny surviving population is exactly why this gun keeps setting records instead of leveling off. The catch with a gun this valuable is authentication. Fakes are a real problem at this price point, and serious collectors check details like the correct inspector stamp and the exact serial range before trusting a listing. For anyone lucky enough to own a verified original, there's essentially no reason to ever sell, because nothing else in the 1911 world comes close to this level of scarcity. Number 1. Anti-Colt revolvers. Number 1 is the category that sits at the absolute top of the entire collector firearms market. Anti-Colt revolvers, specifically the Patterson, the Walker, and the single-action Army. These aren't guns most people will ever own, but they show exactly what rarity, provenance, and condition can do when they all line up at once. The current record for any firearm ever sold at auction belongs to a Colt single-action Army. The actual revolver Sheriff Pat Garrett used to kill Billy the Kid in 1881. It sold for $6. Euro $3 million at Bonhams in August 2021. A Guinness World Record that still stands. Theodore Roosevelt's personal Colt single-action Army, ordered shortly after an assassination attempt on his life, sold for $1. $466 million at Rock Island Auction Company in December 2020. In May 2026, a cased Colt Patterson set a new record for its category at $1.41 million. That exact revolver, Patterson serial number 515, has passed through some of the most respected collections in the country, with paperwork tracing back to a 1938 sale, where a dealer called it one of the finest Colt outfits ever offered and predicted it would only grow more valuable with time. Nearly 90 years later, that prediction has proven completely correct, and it captures exactly what serious collectors mean when they talk about the importance of a documented paper trail. The only known civilian Colt Walker in existence sold for $1.84 million back in 2018, and a separate Colt Walker tied to the original 1847 government contract that armed Texas Rangers and mounted riflemen during the Mexican-American War has sold for well over $1 million on its own. That kind of consistency across multiple examples, not just one record sale, is exactly why serious collectors treat this entire category as generational rather than speculative. Every single one of these guns proves the same lesson that applies all the way down this list, just at a much larger scale. A firearm's value comes from a combination of how few exist, who owned it and what it did, and how well it survived the decades since. Nobody watching this needs $1 million Colt to start collecting smart, but understanding why these guns command these prices explains exactly what to look for in everything else on this list. Conclusion: every gun on this list proves the same point. Value in this hobby isn't guessed. It's earned through scarcity, documented history, original condition, and genuine demand that holds up over time. None of this guarantees any specific firearm will be worth more next year or in 2027, since prices depend on market conditions that can shift, and a gun's condition and paperwork matter just as much as the model itself. What the numbers do show is a pattern collectors have relied on for generations. Guns that are rare, authentic, and well-preserved tend to hold their place, and often grow in value, long after the shooting world moves on to something new. If you already own something on this list, the smartest move usually isn't cashing out fast. It's protecting the condition, keeping the paperwork, and understanding exactly what you're holding on to.